Here's a question for you to ponder as we dig into this episode. What if rather than completing isolated assignments in siloed subject areas, students were asked to design interdisciplinary projects with real-world impacts that help them build key competencies and ignite their love for learning? Does it sound too good to be true? Well, it is true for Michigan students at FlexTech High School, which has 3 campuses in Brighton, Oakland, and Shepherd. Dr. Sarah Pazur is the Director of School Leadership at FlexTech, and this year she celebrates her 19th year in education. Before leading FlexTech in her current position, she served as both a teacher and a principal at a variety of innovative schools on the east side of Michigan. During all this, she also earned her PhD in educational leadership from Oakland University. On their website, FlexTech is described as a 21st century school that embraces project-based learning because they know understanding and engagement come from meaningful activity. Sarah and I dove deeper into the why and the how behind this vision for student learning. She shared how she's seen firsthand the power of a project-based model of schooling to reignite students' love for learning, even for those students who are struggling in the traditional model before they came to FlexTech. Sarah shared what this innovative approach looks like in practice, offered examples of meaningful student projects that have emerged, and helped me to parse apart the different implications of terms like project-based learning and competency-based learning, and how these two systems can work together in beautiful harmony. During our conversation, Sarah also shed some powerful insights on the myth of the ideal classroom and how 2 trends, the marginalization of online learning and the devaluation of teacher voices, may reflect hidden power structures in the education system that are worthy of further examination.
It's so exciting to see that shift in their personalities and kids that just thrive kind of in that smaller, like homier setting that we've cultivated. They love working on projects instead of working through worksheets. And so we just see this kind of transformation and a love of learning that just blossoms when they come to us. So to me, those are the successes that I think really stand out. It's just that transformation in the student and their love of learning again.
I'm Nikki Herda, and this is Bright, Stories of Hope and Innovation in Michigan Classrooms, a podcast where we celebrate our state's educators and explore the future of learning. Let's dive in. To kick off our interview, Sarah and I started with rapid-fire questions, where I gave her prompts and asked her to say the first thing that came to mind. We're going to kick off with our rapid-fire questions. Are you ready?
I'm ready.
All right. Favorite pizza topping?
Mushrooms.
Last show you watched?
The Hemingway documentary.
Coffee is?
Delicious.
Last thing that made you smile?
Taking a walk in the park yesterday.
Oh. Favorite teacher?
My English teacher from high school.
Good answer. Teachers are?
Superheroes.
Michigan is?
My favorite state.
Oh. Learning is?
Exhilarating.
Innovation is?
Fun.
The person who most inspired your view on education?
Maxine Green.
The future of education is?
Amazing.
Students need?
Love.
Teachers need?
Support.
I'm hopeful that?
Things are getting better.
Sarah's passion for project-based learning first took root during her undergraduate teaching program, where, in one of her classes, she had an opportunity to tour schools with innovative approaches to learning in the Metro Detroit area. During this tour, she got to visit University Prep, a project-based learning school where students have the chance to participate in internships throughout the city. She loved it so much that she eventually did her student teaching at University Prep and then began her first year as a full-time teacher there. When FlexTech opened, Sarah served as the founding principal at one of their high schools. I asked her to tell me more about her journey into education and how she has witnessed the teaching profession change over the years.
I think what I realized was just like reflecting on my own education in a very, traditional Catholic school upbringing. I knew that even though, I felt prepared and ready for college, sometimes I didn't feel inspired by my work, and I felt like I was just being more compliant in school instead of creative. And so when I saw the model at University Prep that students were actually designing their own projects and had internships in careers that they might want to pursue later, I was like, wow, this is what I want to do. I want to be part of this movement. So I was able to get my student teaching position there. And I think, though, that, that was the early 2000s when I took my teaching job. And I think the shift that I've seen since then, even though that was innovative, it wasn't necessarily embraced by the larger community. And I think now, since the pandemic, I think people are starting to see that learning doesn't just have to happen in the classroom, that it can happen anywhere at any time, and we can be more flexible, and understanding the importance of social and emotional support and that one-on-one relationship between the teacher, and I was called an advisor at the time, the advisor and the student. So I think we've come to sort of a place now where that almost seems like that's going to have to be the mainstream, where before we were kind of an outlier in the early 2000s. I think the other thing that changed is, technology. It's at the time, the internet and, was seen kind of as a luxury or an add-on, and not every student had a Chromebook to work on. And now it's just common that every student needs a device. We know that students need to be connected. So I think that's a huge shift in terms of access and resources to materials. I think students now, if they don't, we know that that's important. It's a utility and important to have, where I think before that was kind of seen as a luxury. So those are maybe some of the examples over time. And I think, also where students and parents are a little bit more inclined to be critical of their school experience. And that's a good thing. I think that parents are more vocal, students are more vocal about what they want to see happen in schools, especially around, racism or inequities and social justice issues in school. Like, those things are at the forefront now, which is awesome. And I think that focus has changed over time, where it used to be something that was kind of in the background and wasn't addressed. I think now it's front and center, and that's really exciting.
You were talking about technology, right? And this may seem like an obvious answer, but I want to kind of see what you'd say. You're talking about how now we understand that technology, like every student needs a device, and it's a utility, not a luxury. Can you speak a little bit about like why that is? Why is that so important to student learning?
Sure. I think it has to do with our old paradigm of education, which was very much about memorizing knowledge and facts and being able to spit that information back out on a test or in a presentation. And I think that now we understand that students have that information at their fingertips. They can literally pull up an answer to anything they need, or watch an instructional video on how to do something. And so that is the focus is no longer on memorizing, but it's how to be kind of a critical consumer of technology and information. So I think that's the shift that I see, and the importance that technology plays now, is that it's almost kind of a given for most students. And I know that there's still a divide and inequities in terms of access, but understanding it's so embedded in the fabric of our everyday lives now that now the question is, how can we give students the skills they need to be really critical of the information they're coming across, so that they can, make informed decisions, or, be safe on the internet and collaborate and solve problems using technology.
A lot of what I learned, was memorization based. I remember memorizing all these dates in history and memorizing the parts of a cell and memorizing, for every subject I can think of some test that I had to memorize. And, what you're saying is it's almost sounds like, the way humans learn has changed because of the internet, and the quick access to information, which is really when you start thinking about it on a grand scale, like not just for kids, but just for humans, that's kind of
right. And just how we can work together in the global connectedness now that we have access to, where before everything was just confined to that classroom and that teacher and the students in that room. And now if you think about it, students have such like broader access to information and global knowledge and information. So I think that, yeah, it really shifts kind of the way that we go about education in general, for sure.
across their 3 high school campuses. FlexTech serves about 500 Michigan students in grades 9 through 12. Students at FlexTech work to demonstrate competencies through projects. They also offer flexible scheduling, which means that students can either access their learning materials 100% virtually or through a blended model which mixes face-to-face and online instruction. They found that this model works well for students who want to dual enroll, take on an internship, have a job, experience anxiety, or simply have another life circumstance in which having flexibility over learning is a considerable benefit. I asked her to tell me more about the kinds of student success she's witnessed at FlexTech since beginning there in 2011 as a founding principal. Across their 3 high school campuses, FlexTech serves about 500 Michigan students in grades 9 through 12. Students at FlexTech work to demonstrate competencies through projects. They also offer flexible scheduling, which means that students can either access their learning materials 100% virtually or through a blended model, which mixes face-to-face and online instruction. They found that this model works really well for students who want to dual enroll, take on an internship, have a job, experience anxiety, or simply have another life circumstance in which having flexibility over learning is a considerable benefit. I asked her to tell me more about the kinds of student success she's witnessed at FlexTech since beginning there in 2011 as a founding principal.
The students that come to us often have started at other high schools, more traditional school models, and maybe didn't feel successful there for whatever reason. Either it was too big and they felt lost and maybe overwhelmed by a really large campus, and maybe they were socially anxious about being in an environment like that, or maybe they were just bored with the work. So we often see students who just felt disengaged with the traditional textbook-driven model, kind of going bell to bell every hour, and they wanted something different and more hands-on. And so we tend to attract students who were kind of disengaged or unhappy at their previous district. And it's so exciting to see that shift in their personalities, and kids that just thrive kind of in that smaller, like homier setting that we've cultivated. They love working on projects instead of working through worksheets. And so we just see this kind of transformation and a love of learning that just blossoms when they come to us. So to me, those are the successes that I think really stand out. It's just that transformation in the student and their love of learning again.
What is your vision for student learning? It's another big question, but just to give you your time to articulate what you wish every student could experience. Like if it were up to you, Sarah.
Yes. I really think it's important for schools to foster and sustain curiosity and agency in the learning process, so that students are invested in the work that they're doing because it matters to them, but also because it has an impact in the world that they're a part of. So I think making sure that we're sort of still building those important skills, those transferable skills that students need for when they leave school, but that we're doing it through work that really is meaningful to that student. So that's my vision, is that kids are inspired and they're connected to the work that they're doing, and that they see school as a part of life, not separate from life. that's my vision, is that school no longer becomes this dread, right? Like it's there that there's a reason you go to school is because it's going to help you do something you really care about, and have an impact on the world. So that's my utopian vision.
And how do you guys, that seems pretty in line with what you do at FlexTech. So could you speak a little bit to like what that looks like in practice?
Sure. So all of our courses are project based. So if you're a student at FlexTech, ultimately what you're doing is you're solving problems in your class around, or that help you kind of like cultivate those skills within that discipline. So, if you're a math student, you're working on a project while you're still practicing mathematical skills that you would need or that are required for you, to be successful. So it's a method of learning that frames kind of the skills within a bigger question. So we call these like essential questions. And students are working throughout the semester or the marking period to answer this question. So sometimes it means working in small groups. Sometimes it means, a mini lesson from the teacher and you're practicing a skill. Sometimes it means you're interviewing somebody in the community to get more information, or you're online researching. But ultimately, all of your work is around this project, and you're working on that over the course of the marking period. So even though students leave us prepared with those same skills that you would need to have, that the Michigan Merit Curriculum, they're doing it in a different way that's more exciting and meaningful to them. We often give kids an opportunity to demonstrate their mastery through projects that, they care about. So even though the teacher may pose a project or an essential question and the team works on that, kids can take that off into different avenues and focus on one specific aspect that is exciting to them. So as long as they're showing that they can master the skill, we give them a lot of autonomy over how they demonstrate that. And I think that kind of leads into the other part of what it looks like is assessment is really different. So we are fully competency-based. So a project might address, two competencies or two learning standards that you would normally maybe work on through a textbook and then get quizzed on. Instead, our students are working on building that, building their mastery of those things over time through the project. And then at the end, a student would, either present their project if it's a presentation, or maybe it's a solution to a community problem. So maybe they're getting feedback from community members, but at the end, it's about giving students feedback on how they did to solve that problem. So it's not necessarily a test or a quiz, but it certainly is, feedback from an authentic audience that gives students kind of what the next steps are that they need to do to revise or be better.
Could you give us an example of like how of an essential question, maybe what kind of standard it might relate to, and then like a project a student might take on, like that kind of sequence?
Yeah, I'm trying to think. I always use this example. I forget the exact essential question, but it's sort of like it was a geometry class, and the students were looking at like how can I reduce my impact, my environmental impact, or reduce waste, I guess might have been the way it was framed. And students looked at packaging of like maybe their favorite item or like, game or whatever it is. And they looked at the way that it might be packaged and shipped. And so they had to write a proposal to that company saying like, here are the ways that you could reduce the packaging waste in this product. And so they calculated what was the minimum amount of packaging they needed to make sure that the product still stayed intact and could be shipped, but it was, more environmentally friendly. So the students used math to like figure that out, but then they also used other interdisciplinary skills like how to, write a compelling argument to the audience that they were sending it to. So, if they wrote the company and said, here's what I'm proposing you do, here's how much money you'll save if you reduce this, here's the impact it would have on the environment over time. So they're using these mathematical skills, but they're also using, English skills to make a compelling argument with evidence. So those are some examples of, maybe a math English related project, an environmental science project, where it actually had a real impact on something that students felt like they could change, and they tried to do it. So some of the companies did write students back, so that was cool. But yeah, just making sure that like the project has kind of like the stakes are higher, like it's not just, oh, I need to learn these math skills just to get quizzed, but I'm going to do this because it might have an impact on the environment, or it might change what this company's practices are. So I think that's what makes project-based learning so exciting, is that we raise the stakes, and it's like it's real and it has a real impact.
That's so cool. I remember always thinking that I taught like first year writing for a couple years in graduate school. And, so often I think that's the essays that you give students can feel a little bit false, right? Because I'm the only one reading it. They're writing it and I'm reading it. But to have them write an argument that actually could make a difference, I feel like you'd see their skills shine in a whole new way too, because they also can honor the authenticity of the project, that it actually does something in the world rather than just kind of existing in this little academic bubble.
So. Exactly, yes.
Very cool. Can you think of any examples off the top of your head of just like a student, like a specific story of a student who really thrived in this model that was like struggling before? Obviously you don't have to use their name, but just like where they started versus where they left from FlexTech?
Sure. I was thinking about one of my favorite projects at FlexTech. It was a partnership that we had with the Village Workshop, which is a makerspace in Northville. Unfortunately, I don't think they're there anymore, but at the time we had a partnership with them, and 16 of our students went there for a full year, and they learned the different tools inside the different shops. So they worked through like the wood shop, the machine shop, textiles, metalworking, and they learned how to use all of the tools in the makerspace. And then at the end of that, they had to propose kind of a community project or a community problem that they wanted to solve. And they used what they learned at the makerspace to solve this problem. And so one of the students, she suffered from social anxiety and knew that a lot of the students in our school sometimes have, suffer from anxiety. And one of the things that she proposed for our school community was kind of like just like an oasis, kind of like in the school, where it was like a room where you could kind of go and just like decompress or be alone, or just, a safe space where students could go and, a quiet space where they could be. And so she constructed a whole space in our school community, and it became this awesome like safe haven for kids who just needed to kind of get away from the hustle and bustle and just, be in a quiet atmosphere to kind of bring down anxiety levels. And so this became like really important to our school. And it was just so neat to see kind of her like use her own experience and think about like, how could I help others that feel this way too? And it became kind of a permanent fixture in our school. So that was one really cool example to see kind of a transformation of a student who, maybe would have never gotten that opportunity in a traditional setting. And, not only she got to address her own kind of anxiety, but she helped others too. And I think that was just a phenomenal example of, something that I think wouldn't be fostered in a different environment that we were able to do for her. And she did for herself, I should say. But yeah, some other examples of students doing work from the Village Workshop that had a really great impact in the community were we had a girl do kind of like a Save the Bees campaign. And so she made bee boxes and put them around Belle Isle. That was a really cool example. We had another student who built furniture for a retirement home. And then we had another student who made chessboards and checkerboards for students at Children's Hospital who were going through cancer treatments. And he was able to drop these like off for them to use while they were, in their hospital stay. So just, I think those examples just speak to kind of the way that project-based learning can also be very community and service oriented. And I think that kids are developing empathy through those experiences.
There are so many overlapping terms in education that it can all get a little confusing until you see how they look in practice. Two terms that came up often during my conversation with Sarah were project-based learning and competency-based learning. During this next part of our interview, I tried to articulate my understanding of the difference between the two and asked Sarah to unpack these concepts a little bit further and explain how they can work in tandem to benefit students. You spoke a little bit about competency-based learning already. I'm wondering if you could talk about just the interplay between project-based and competency-based learning. I think I get it. So let me real quick see if I can say it, and you can tell me if this is right and
Sure.
correct any misconceptions.
Okay.
So you were saying that project-based learning kind of scaffolds like the way students do the assignments, and competency-based learning is almost more about the way that that's assessed based on like key skills. Is that right? Or how would you expand on that?
Yeah, that's a great intersection. Exactly. So project-based learning is kind of the method of instruction, and then competency-based learning plays a part in that. So when a student's working on a project, they're developing certain competencies throughout that project. And the difference between competency-based and traditional grading is that students are trying to master this skill or this competency over time, and they're given as much or as little time as they need. They can set their own pace. So it's based on mastery. It's not based on seat time. So it's not like, at the end of the semester, the students either you get it or you don't. And if you didn't, you got to start back from the beginning and retake the class. It's really about allowing students to work through those skills over time. And I think that's the big shift. It's also just way more transparent. So a student understands what it takes to get, a 4-point level on a competency, and it tells you, like, if you achieve a 4, this means you know how to do this, this, and this. So it's very transparent for students. So there's no guessing on what does it mean to get an A. Like, is it because I did a pretty poster, or is it because, I was compliant and quiet? There's no confusing the grade with other things that happen in a classroom. It's all about, did you master this skill? And I think that gives students a lot of agency, and because they know exactly what they're working towards. They know what they need to do to revise work to get to that level. And it's really just, the focus remains on the learning and the skills, not on any of those other ancillary things that sometimes get padded in with grades.
I just thought of a question. I'm curious what you'll think about it. So, I was just thinking in my head what, opposition somebody might have towards this, like who's raised in the traditional model. And I was wondering, what kind of tensions do you experience with like having to meet these different like standardized tests and like all the different requirements for the Michigan Merit Curriculum? Like, is there a weird tension there at all, or you find you're able to pretty satisfactorily do all of that and prepare students for standardized testing and stuff with this model?
Yeah, I think what competency-based learning does is it says, okay, what are the big, like, enduring understandings or big ideas that kids need to know, out of this discipline or whatever, this area of study. And it's about depth, like really getting kids to think deeply about fewer standards, I guess, than it is to have them check off, oh, I know how to do this, 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 and then they forget it, or they have to spit it back on a test and then they forget it after that. So it's more so focusing on those like critical competencies, those big ideas, and then through that project, they're able to spend a lot of time going deeply in these concepts. So, certainly we pay attention to things like the SAT because, some of those skills definitely cross over to the SAT. And we actually have done crosswalks where we say, okay, what are some of the things that you might be tested on and where would that show up in a project in that same discipline? So we're aware of it. We just don't make the test the focus. We make the competency the focus, and we want depth over breadth.
Last year, Sarah published an article titled "The Myth of the Ideal Classroom" that, honestly, really blew my mind. It was released in October 2020 at the height of the pandemic, and as its title suggests, it explores how the myth of the ideal classroom may be preventing us from accepting the legitimacy of online learning. She cites research debunking this myth by showing that both models of learning, face-to-face and online, can be done effectively or ineffectively, neither being intrinsically better than the other. Part of the stigma around online learning, she says, has to do with the marginalization of the students who historically have been the benefactors of this modality and who may be misjudged for not making it in the quote-unquote ideal classroom. She shares her own experience as a young pregnant mother in a traditional Catholic school and how she wishes she'd had online opportunities at the time to continue her education in a way that would have allowed her to thrive. She also unpacks how the stigma contributes to the illusion that online learning is only for outliers. I asked Sarah to tell me more about her argument and her experiences in her own words.
I wrote, I guess my argument was that, oftentimes online learning is seen as like the inferior mode of instruction, and it's kind of, sometimes viewed as a last resort for students who need credit recovery, or students who may have been expelled from school, or students who had some sort of family crisis and they can't be in sort of quote unquote the ideal classroom. So we push them off into the margins, and therefore I think there's this stigma kind of associated with online learning, which just isn't true. And I think that, it's a very valuable mode of instruction, and it helps a lot of students in those life circumstances, and that our tendency to kind of stigmatize or view it as inferior is more about attitudes towards, students who don't fit the traditional mode. So I wrote this argument and I personalized it because I was a student who had to be away from high school for a while. I was a teen mom. And so when I was 17, I had my son. And, I was a senior in high school, which, what that's like. You're trying to finish school, and, in a Catholic school, so you can even imagine, how a teen mom would be perceived in that setting. It was very difficult, and having to be away from kind of what's considered the ideal method of school, you can be sort of, stereotyped and stigmatized. And so it was tough being away from school and not having access to what I needed, or to feel a part of the school community. And I kind of wrote in this article a little bit about how I would have really appreciated the chance to work online, and to stay up to date with my assignments and feel like I was still part of school. And that was in the 90s, so there weren't a lot of online learning options then. So I just kind of mused a little bit about that, and, thinking about how there's so many students like me who take advantage of distance learning opportunities, and how it helps them kind of complete school and graduate, and that we shouldn't be looking down our noses at those students who take advantage of those opportunities, that we should embrace online learning for what it is. And it's just as legitimate as face-to-face learning, and it often helps a lot of students who wouldn't get help otherwise.
Another passion area for Sarah is teacher leadership. In part, this stems from her experiences as a teacher, where her voice was truly valued, and how empowering this experience was for her. She shares her perspective that too often our teachers' voices are devalued, and in part, this remains a gender equity issue due to the predominantly female demographic makeup of our nation's teachers. I asked her to tell me more about this.
I think teaching is the absolute best profession in the world, and teachers are so important to, building a thriving and cooperative society. And unfortunately, I think oftentimes they're devalued, and their voice is devalued when it comes to shaping school policy and practice. And I think that as someone who was a teacher in a school startup situation, I got to see and experience what that felt like to have a voice in shaping my school. And it was very exhilarating and affirming and empowering. And I remember thinking at the time, like, if I'm ever in a leadership position, I hope that I can center the teacher voice the way that I felt I was centered. And so as a principal, it was important to me to have leadership roles for teachers, but also to kind of embed protocols, I guess, around shared decision making, in staff meetings and for staff events or things that we were doing as a school community. So that's always been important to me, because I remember kind of what that felt like as a teacher. And I also think it is like a gender equity issue too, that, I'm very passionate about it, because women make up the majority of the teaching force in the United States. I think it's like 76% of teachers are women. And so when we think about teaching in the way that it's kind of cast negatively in society and it's devalued through the pay gap or through silencing teacher voices, we're essentially silencing women. And I really want to elevate teachers, I think, because they're important, but also because this is definitely a gender issue as well that is important to me, that I think that we need to put the focus on more than it really is.
To end our conversation on a bright note, I asked Sarah to share her hopes for the future and what advice she has for her fellow educators as we emerge from pandemic learning conditions and begin to build the groundwork for the next era of education.
I am hopeful that since we've kind of reconstituted the boundaries of school, where we have demonstrated that students don't need to be in the classroom to learn, that they can learn from places outside of school, the school building, and they can learn on their own time at their own pace, that I think that this is going to become more in part of the mainstream in education is flexibility, not focusing so much on seat time, but more on mastery of learning. And I'm pretty hopeful that some of those things will, make their way back into mainstream education. And I think we've learned from that a little bit that, back to the technology thing, that students deserve and absolutely need technology and access to the internet. I also think that we've learned, this is not competing with what I just said, but I think it's like in addition to it that students do need the face-to-face social emotional part that school offered. So I think we're going to meet somewhere in the middle. And we're going to see a shift more towards like hybrid modes of learning or flexible schedules so that students still get all of those things that, schools provide: meals, social and emotional support, physical support, that they're going to still get those things, but that we're going to give them a little bit more autonomy and flexibility.
What advice or words of wisdom do you have for your fellow educators right now, if any?
I think that now is the time to really do some deep listening, the students and all the stakeholders in your community on what has been working for them. I think don't rush into going back to the way things were pre-pandemic. I know it can be tempting to feel like we just want to go back to normal, but I think it's important to do some really targeted research and ask what's been working for you and see how you can sort of bring those successes back into the school model when we do return, quote unquote, to normal, and really learn from this, because, so many students have been benefiting from some of the changes that have happened, I think, and we need to remember those students and how we can incorporate those experiences back into school when we return.
After my conversation with Sarah, I was left inspired by the innovative approach to learning they've implemented at the campuses of FlexTech High School. They've created a space for students seeking an alternative to traditional schooling that really allows them to reignite their love of learning through flexibility and opportunities to engage in meaningful projects. After talking with Sarah, I couldn't help but reflect on her experiences as a teen mother and how beautiful it is that she works every day to give students who are going through experiences like hers an opportunity to take control of their education and really make it theirs. I also couldn't help but think about how cool it would have been to be in a program like this as a student, to apply your thinking in such a meaningful way where you could actually create real-world change while you're still in high school. I have to imagine that it would help you make the connection between learning as a purely academic act and learning as a social act, in which knowledge is something that helps us build stronger communities and create a better world, not just something that lives in textbooks. As we look to the future, we'll continue to celebrate Michigan educators, sharing their hopes, their fears, their dreams, and their beliefs in what's best for our children as we move forward into a new era of post-pandemic learning. Without a doubt, it's hard work to implement project-based learning at scale in a way that allows students to explore their interests, meet core competencies, and have real-world impacts. But with leaders like Sarah forging our path forward, if there's one thing we're certain of, it's that the future is bright. Thank you for joining us for this episode of Bright, Stories of Hope and Innovation in Michigan Classrooms. This podcast is produced by Herbie Gaylord, is hosted by me, Nikki Herda, and is made possible by Michigan Virtual, a nonprofit organization that's leading and collaborating to build learning environments for tomorrow. Education is changing faster than ever. Discover new models and resources to move learning forward at your school at michiganvirtual.org.